What if we told you that the period between 1800 and 1848 wasn't just, a few decades in history, but a true forge, hammering out the core ideas, the conflicts, even the very landscape of the America we know today?
Yeah, it's more than just dates and names.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today we're plunging into an age of American transformation, 1800, 1848.
A crucial period.
Our mission, to sift through your sources. We've got analyses of political parties, the market revolution, cultural shifts, reform movements, and the really difficult subject of slavery, and extract the most impactful insights.
Kind of boiling it down.
Exactly. We want to give you a shortcut to understanding how this young republic wrestled with its identity, how it dramatically expanded its reach, and how it grappled with these profound internal contradictions that would, well, echo through history.
It really is a foundational era. You could think of it almost as America's turbulent adolescence. The nation was struggling to define what it really stood for, and what kind of economy it would build, who truly belonged within its expanding borders. And pretty much every major challenge or contradiction we face today, whether it's debates over federal power or social justice movements, it has deep, deep roots in these few decades.
That's exactly why understanding this period is so critical. It was just a whirlwind. You had the rise of fierce political ideologies, an economic revolution that reshaped daily life, a dramatic expansion of democracy, well, for some.
Right, that's a key point. For some,
And these fervent social reforms, all while the nation's trying to assert itself on the world stage and, tragically, confronting the deeply entrenched institution of slavery.
so many moving parts.
We're going to try and connect these seemingly disparate threads into a coherent, compelling story. A story of American growth, yes, but also struggle and profound contradictions.
Little bit
So let's
small.
unpack this.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's begin our deep dive by exploring how this young nation started to truly define itself, both within its borders and on the global stage during the early 1800s. We're stepping to the era of forging a nation.
What's truly fascinating here, I think, is that the period from 1800 to the 1820s wasn't just about, politicians in powdered wigs making decisions in Philadelphia or
Right.
Washington.
No.
It was about the very philosophical bedrock of the republic being laid down and debated really intensely. The core tension, well, it was fundamentally about how much power the federal government should truly have.
Oh.
And tied to that, what kind of economic future the nation should pursue. This wasn't abstract theory. It shaped every aspect of American life and development back then.
And these big philosophical disagreements, they didn't stay philosophical for long, did they? They quickly crystallized into the nation's first real political parties.
Exactly.
So on one side, you had the Federalists, famously associated with Alexander Hamilton. What was their vision for America?
Okay, so the Federalists, they championed a powerful, centralized federal government. They believed it was absolutely essential for national unity, for economic stability.
Makes
Their vision was really an America driven by manufacturing and commerce. They wanted a strong national bank, robust trade ties, and they were, well, largely looking to emulate the economic success of Great Britain at the time.
And then, in direct opposition, you had the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. Their vision couldn't have been more different, could it?
Not at all. Polar opposites in many ways. Jefferson advocated for a much more limited central government. He really feared the concentration of power, the potential for tyranny.
Right, the classic fear.
His ideal America, it was an agrarian republic, a nation of independent, self-sufficient yeoman farmers. That was the dream. So this clash between, industrial ambition on one hand and agrarian independence on the other, that was the foundational debate of the young republic.
So Jefferson wins the election of 1800, and it's famously dubbed the Revolution of 1800.
Yeah.
Why was that such a pivotal moment beyond just, winning an election?
It was genuinely astonishing for its time because it marked the first peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another in American history.
Which hadn't really happened before anywhere, reliably.
Think about it. A deeply divided nation, bitter political rivals, accusations flying, yet the transition was orderly. This wasn't just a change in leadership. It was a profound testament to the strength, or at least the devolving stability, of the American democratic experiment. It proved the system could handle these partisan shifts without just collapsing into chaos.
Okay, so Jefferson's in office. How did he actually put his ideals of limited federal power into practice? What did he do?
Well, he moved pretty quickly to roll back some key Federalist policies. He got Congress to repeal the unpopular whiskey tax, which had caused a rebellion earlier.
Right.
He aimed to shrink the military, reduce the national debt, and cut down the number of federal jobs. These were all direct efforts to align federal actions with his vision of a less intrusive, more decentralized government, trying to walk the talk.
But then right here, we hit a pretty significant contradiction for Jefferson himself. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803.
Yes, the big one.
Napoleon, dealing with the fallout from the Haitian Revolution and needing cash for his wars in Europe, unexpectedly offers to sell the entire Louisiana territory to the U.S. for, what, $15 million?
An unbelievable bargain even then.
But Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed the federal government could only do what was explicitly written in the Constitution. And the Constitution said absolutely nothing about the president or Congress buying vast tracts of foreign land. So, what did he do?
This was, you could say, Jefferson's ultimate test of principle versus pragmatism. Despite his deep, genuine reservations about exceeding constitutional authority, and he really wrestled with it.
I bet.
The lure of westward expansion, doubling the size of the country, it was just too strong to resist. He justified the purchase by arguing it would provide land for future generations of those yeoman farmers he idealized.
Okay, so connecting it back to his core vision.
Exactly. And, crucially, he argued it would expand American influence while reducing European presence, particularly French and potentially Spanish, in North America. So the key insight here, I think, is that Jefferson, the champion of limited government, ultimately prioritized the massive pragmatic benefits of national expansion.
They'll decisize the U.S. overnight.
Doubled it. Even if it meant stretching his own constitutional principles, arguably to their breaking point, it set a huge precedent.
So even as the executive branch is grappling with its power, stretching it maybe, another branch of government was dramatically asserting its own authority. John Marshall, the fourth Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
A giant figure.
He's often credited with doing more to expand federal power and judicial authority than anyone else in this period. How did he manage that?
Marshall truly reshaped the balance of power in ways that are still felt very strongly today. His greatest legacy, undoubtedly, came through landmark Supreme Court decisions. Take Marbury v. Madison in 1803. This case, it arose from President John Adams's last-minute judicial appointments, the so-called midnight judges, right before he left office.
Trying to stack the courts.
Pretty much. When James Madison, who was Jefferson's new Secretary of State, refused to deliver some of these commissions, one of the appointees, William Marbury, sued Madison directly.
Okay, so what was Marshall's ingenious move in that decision? It seems like a straightforward political fight.
Well, Marshall's brilliance was in how he navigated it. He essentially sided with neither party in a way that seemed, on the surface, to weaken the court's immediate power, but actually vastly expanded it long term. He declared that while Marbury did have a right to his commission, the Supreme Court couldn't force Madison to deliver it.
Why not?
Because, Marshall argued, the specific part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 that allowed Marbury to bring his case directly to the Supreme Court was itself unconstitutional.
Ah.
So the truly groundbreaking insight here is that Marshall, through this seemingly minor case about commissions, asserted the Supreme Court's power as the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution. The power of judicial review.
The power to strike down laws passed by Congress.
Exactly. It was, in effect, a silent coup, a massive power grab that fundamentally reshaped the balance of power in America for centuries to come, all without firing a single shot. It ensured the Supreme Court became a truly co-equal branch of government, a power you see debated constantly today.
That is a profound shift just through legal reasoning.
Okay.
And he further solidified federal power in another key case later, McCulloch v. Maryland.
Indeed. That was in 1819. McCulloch v. Maryland asked two critical questions. First, could Congress even create a national bank, since that power isn't explicitly listed in the Constitution?
Right, the old debate again.
And second, if Congress could create it, could a state like Maryland tax that federal bank? Marshall ruled emphatically yes, Congress did have the implied power to create a bank under the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution.
The elastic clause.
Precisely. And crucially, he ruled, no, a state could not tax a federal institution. His famous declaration, the power to tax involves the power to destroy, meant that national law reigns supreme over state laws whenever they conflict. This decision was just a powerful blow for federal supremacy, cementing the idea of a strong, unified national government over potentially fractious states.
Okay, so beyond these internal political structures and power struggles, America was also, maybe cautiously, stepping onto the world stage, trying to defend its sovereignty. Your sources highlight that trade was a really significant driving force behind this foreign policy.
Absolutely. Trade was lifeblood, especially for certain regions. A compelling example of this is the Barbary Wars, which happened early in Jefferson's presidency from about 1801 to 1805.
What were those about?
Well, for years, European powers and even the young U.S. under Washington and Adams had paid tribute, basically protection money, to the Barbary states of North Africa, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, to protect their merchant ships from piracy in the Mediterranean.
Right, paying them off.
Jefferson, however, true to his principles perhaps, refused to pay an increased tribute demanded by Tripoli. Instead, he sent the fledgling U.S. Navy to retaliate. This wasn't just a commercial dispute. It was America's first real overseas military engagement. It was a bold assertion of independence from relying on European protection for American commerce, and it demonstrated the nation's willingness, even early on, to use force to protect its economic interests.
Speaking of European interference, Jefferson's response to British and French disruptions of American shipping during the Napoleonic Wars was the Embargo Act of 1807.
That sounds pretty drastic. It banned all U.S. foreign trade.
It was incredibly drastic and deeply contentious. Democratic Republicans generally supported it, hoping to use economic coercion, peaceable coercion, Jefferson called it, to force respect from Britain and France without resorting to war. They saw it as a way to protect American honor and sailors.
But how is it received on the ground? Well, Federalists, particularly in maritime New England, whose economy depended heavily on shipping and trade, they vehemently criticized it. It had a devastating economic impact on them. Ports were idle, sailors were unemployed. The insight here, again, is that even attempts at national unity in foreign policy could expose these deep regional fault lines and clashing economic self-interests. The embargo largely failed and was repealed.
And those tensions eventually did escalate into war. The War of 1812, under James Madison. What were the core reasons America finally declared war on Great Britain?
It was a convergence of several factors. The big one was continued British impressment of American sailors, basically kidnapping them off American ships and forcing them into the Royal Navy.
Which must have been infuriating.
Hugely. Add to that British restrictions on U.S. trade, part of their blockade against Napoleonic France. And to a lesser extent, there was a perception, especially on the frontier, that the British were aiding Native American confederacies in the Great Lakes region, groups led by figures like Tecumseh who were resisting American westward expansion.
And there was also internal pressure, right? The war hawks.
Yes, exactly. A faction of young, aggressive Democratic Republicans in Congress, mostly from the South and West, figures like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, ironically, they pushed hard for war. They wanted to assert national honor, maybe grab some territory in Canada or Florida. They saw it as a second war for independence in a way.
And once again, we see that familiar regional divide playing out, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. The war found strong support in the South and West, where expansionist sentiments were high and grievances against the British and their native allies were strong. But it faced fierce opposition from New England Federalists. Their economy was heavily reliant on trade with Britain, and they saw the war as disastrous.
Didn't they even consider leaving the Union?
Their dissent peaked at the Hartford Convention in 1814, where some radical Federalists actually did discuss secession, or at least radical changes to the Constitution to protect their region's interests. While the war itself concluded with the Treaty of Ghent, basically a stalemate with no territorial gains for either side, it had major consequences. It ignited a powerful wave of American nationalism. Think of the Star-Spangled Banner.
Right.
And significantly, it led to the final demise of the Federalist Party. They were seen as disloyal, even treasonous, because of the Hartford Convention. This really marked a shift in the political landscape, ushering in the so-called era of good feelings, though the feelings weren't always that good.
So after the War of 1812, the U.S. was also busy literally defining and expanding its borders. We saw significant territorial growth during this time.
Indeed. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814, as I said, ended the war but didn't resolve all the border issues. However, subsequent agreements, like the Convention of 1818 with Britain, settled the northern border with Canada along the 49th parallel, all the way to the Rocky Mountains, and established joint U.S.-British occupation of the Oregon Territory out west.
And then there was Florida. How did the U.S. acquire Florida?
Florida was still controlled by Spain, but Spain's grip was weakening, partly due to rebellions in its South American colonies. This led to instability on the Florida-Georgia border. Seminole Indians, sometimes joined by escaped slaves, would conduct raids into U.S. territory and then retreat back into Spanish Florida, where U.S. troops couldn't legally follow them.
This sounds like a job for Andrew Jackson.
You guessed it. General Andrew Jackson enters the picture again. He was dispatched by President James Monroe in 1818 with orders to stop the raids, but specifically not to engage Spanish forces directly.
Did he follow those orders?
Not exactly. Jackson, being Jackson, brazenly exceeded his orders. He marched into Florida, attacked 2 Spanish forts, deposed the Spanish governor, and executed Seminole chiefs and even 2 British citizens he accused of aiding the Seminoles.
Wow. That must have caused an international incident.
It did cause a huge diplomatic uproar, but his aggressive actions, though highly controversial, effectively pressured Spain. Seeing American determination, perhaps fearing Jackson might just take the rest of Florida by force, and facing troubles elsewhere in its empire, Spain decided to cut its losses. They sold Florida to the U.S. through the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819.
So what's the insight there?
It demonstrates pretty clearly that the U.S. was not afraid to use military power, even arguably unauthorized military power, and diplomatic pressure to expand its territory. And tragically, this policy often went hand in hand with Indian removal, as the Seminole Wars that followed showed.
So with this growing territorial success and a swelling sense of national confidence, the U.S. felt emboldened enough to issue a really powerful statement limiting European influence in the entire Western Hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine.
Exactly. This was articulated by President Monroe in his annual message to Congress in 1823, though largely crafted by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. This landmark policy declared that the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, was essentially America's backyard. It stated that the American continents were henceforth off-limits to future European colonization or interference in the affairs of the newly independent Latin American republics.
That sounds incredibly bold for such a young nation. Do they have the power to back it up?
Honestly, not really, not at that time. The U.S. lacked the military power to fully enforce it against major European powers. In reality, it was the British Navy that largely kept other European powers out of the Americas for much of the 19th century, as it served British interests too.
Ah, okay.
But the symbolic impact was huge. It was a profound challenge to European authority, asserting a nascent U.S. dominance in the region and implicitly claiming the role of protector or perhaps hegemon. The sheer audacity of this declaration by a relatively young nation is a powerful insight into its growing self-perception and ambition on the world stage.
Now, despite these grand national aspirations, you mentioned several times how regional interests consistently clashed with national concerns. Henry Clay's American system was an attempt to unify the nation economically, but even that plan highlighted these deep divisions.
Yeah, Clay's American system, it's often summarized by the acronym BIT, was proposed as a comprehensive national economic plan. The War of 1812 had really exposed some serious weaknesses in the U.S. economy, like a lack of reliable credit and terrible transportation infrastructure.
Okay, so what did BIT stand for?
It had 3 core components. B was for a national bank, specifically the Second Bank of the United States, chartered in 1816 to provide a stable national currency and regulate credit. I stood for federally funded internal improvements, things like roads and canals, the Cumberland Road being a prime example, to link the distant regions, helping farmers and merchants get goods to market.
Yeah, T.
T was for tariffs. Protective tariffs, meaning taxes on imported goods, designed to shield nascent U.S. manufacturers from foreign competition, particularly from Britain. The idea was to create a self-sufficient national economy.
Sounds like a pretty sensible plan for national unity, fostering connections between regions. But it met resistance, particularly from the South.
It did, big time. Even presidents like Madison and Monroe, who were Democratic Republicans, often objected to the federal funding for roads and canals. They argued it was an unconstitutional overreach of federal power, believing such projects should be state or private responsibilities. That strict constructionist view again.
And the tariffs were also a problem for the South.
A huge problem. The South, being largely agrarian and heavily reliant on exporting crops like cotton and tobacco and importing manufactured goods, felt these tariffs primarily benefited northern industries while increasing their own costs for imported goods. They also feared that high U.S. tariffs would provoke retaliatory tariffs from other countries, hurting their agricultural exports.
So it was seen as sectional favoritism.
Exactly. The Compromise Tariff of 1833, which significantly reduced tariff rates after the nullification crisis, is a prime example of this ongoing regional conflict. National policies designed, at least in theory, for unity were constantly viewed through a regional lens, often exacerbating rather than resolving these deep economic divisions between the industrializing North and the agrarian South.
And nowhere did these regional interests clash more dramatically and more dangerously than over the issue of slavery, especially as the nation expanded westward. Missouri's application for statehood in 1819 really brought this issue to a boiling point, didn't it?
It was a genuine crisis, a potentially nation-breaking crisis. At the time, the Senate had this delicate, perfect balance: 11 free states and 11 slave states. This parity was absolutely crucial for Southern states. It meant they could block any anti-slavery legislation in the Senate, even if it passed the House where the North had more population.
So Missouri threatened that balance.
Precisely. Missouri, carved out of the Louisiana Purchase, was poised to enter as a slave state. This would tip the balance, giving the South more political power and, just as importantly, signaling that slavery could expand into the vast new Western territories. Northerners were alarmed.
And then came the Tallmadge Amendment. What was that?
New York Congressman James Tallmadge proposed an amendment to Missouri's statehood bill. It stipulated that no more slaves could be brought into Missouri, and that children of slaves already there would be freed at age 25. Essentially, it provided for gradual emancipation in Missouri.
How did that go over?
Northerners, keen to restrict slavery's spread, generally supported it passionately. Southerners, however, saw it as an existential threat. They viewed it as a direct attack on property rights, and more terrifyingly, a precedent that could eventually lead to the abolition of slavery in all states. Some Southern representatives openly threatened secession over it. The vote in the House fell strictly along sectional lines, North versus South, revealing this deep, seemingly unbridgeable chasm that had opened up.
So another critical moment where Henry Clay, the great compromiser, steps into the breach.
Yes, Clay played a pivotal role again. His Missouri Compromise, passed in 1820, temporarily diffused the crisis. It was a package deal. First, Missouri was admitted to the Union as a slave state, just as the South wanted.
Okay.
But to maintain the Senate balance, Maine, which had previously been part of Massachusetts, was simultaneously admitted as a free state.
Keeping the numbers even.
Exactly. And crucially, the compromise established a line across the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory, the 36 degrees, 30-minute parallel of latitude. North of that line, with the exception of Missouri itself, slavery would be forever prohibited. South of that line, slavery would be permitted.
So what's the takeaway from the Missouri Compromise? Did it solve the problem?
Well, it certainly calmed everyone down for a while. People breathed a sigh of relief. But the key insight here is that while it temporarily stemmed the growing tensions, it didn't resolve the fundamental issue of slavery and its expansion at all. Instead, it drew a literal line in the sand across the continent, solidifying a geographical divide over slavery. It only delayed the inevitable conflict, essentially setting the stage for far greater crises down the road, ultimately leading to the Civil War. Thomas Jefferson famously called it a fire bell in the night, awakening him to the nation's peril. He saw it, even then, as the potential knell of the Union.
A very ominous sign. Okay, from forging a nation politically, let's now pivot to an even more transformative force, the market revolution. This was, as you said, an economic earthquake that utterly reshaped how Americans produced, consumed, and lived. It impacted everything from demographics to social structures, even gender roles.
Yeah, earthquake is a good word for it. This was a seismic shift. At its core, the market revolution was about fundamentally restructuring the American economy, moving away from, local, mostly self-sufficient, semi-subsistence systems.
Where families produced most of what they needed.
Exactly. Moving from that to a much more interconnected, commercial, market-driven network. It was, as the sources say, the linking of northern industries with western and southern farms. This was driven by a relentless pace of advances in agriculture, in industry, and maybe most importantly, in transportation. It literally knitted these different regional sectors of the economy together into a singular national economic entity, albeit one with strong regional specializations.
So what were the primary engines driving this immense change? What made it happen?
It really started with transportation networks. The need for efficient ways to move goods and people over vast distances was paramount if you wanted a national market. Early efforts included projects like the National Road, also called the Cumberland Road, which was the first major federally funded highway, slowly pushing west from Maryland.
But canals were the real game changer initially, right?
Yeah.
Especially the Erie Canal.
Oh, absolutely. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825 after years of incredibly hard labor, was an engineering marvel for its time. It connected the Great Lakes, the heartland, to New York City via the Hudson River. This one canal dramatically reduced shipping costs and travel times. Goods that took weeks and cost a fortune to transport overland could now move quickly and cheaply.
And that made New York City.
The nation's dominant commercial center, it just exploded. The Erie Canal irrevocably tied the agricultural West to the industrializing East, funneling grain and resources eastward and manufactured goods westward. It was hugely successful and sparked a canal-building boom across the country.
And then steamboats and railroads amplified that connection even further, taking over from canals eventually.
Exactly. Steamboats, pioneered by Robert Fulton, revolutionized river travel. Suddenly, rivers became two-way highways. You could travel upstream just as easily, well, almost as easily, as downstream. This opened up the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys to immense commercial traffic.
Right.
And then, starting in the 1820s and really taking off in the 30s and 40s, came the railroads. Often supported by government land grants and subsidies, railroads began to rapidly expand, offering even faster, more reliable, year-round transportation than canals. Eventually, they surpassed canals in importance. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which began operations in 1828, was a pioneering example, symbolizing this new era of speed and scale in connecting the nation.
So the country's getting connected. But it wasn't just about moving goods. It was also about how goods were made. Industrial technology and organized manufacturing were booming alongside transportation.
Yes, the two went hand in hand. New patent laws passed by Congress encouraged a flurry of innovation. You had figures like Samuel Slater, often called the father of the American factory system. He'd worked in British textile mills and basically memorized the designs, then came to America and illegally recreated them here, effectively kickstarting the U.S. Industrial Revolution in textiles.
And Eli Whitney, besides the cotton gin, he had another huge impact, right? Interchangeable parts.
Perhaps his most impactful long-term innovation, yes. Before Whitney, things like muskets were handcrafted by skilled artisans, each part fitted uniquely to that specific gun. Whitney developed the idea initially for government rifle contracts of mass-producing standardized, identical components.
So any part would fit any gun.
That was the idea. These interchangeable parts could then be assembled into finished products by relatively unskilled laborers rather than highly paid artisans. This concept revolutionized manufacturing, not just for guns, but eventually for clocks, sewing machines, agricultural equipment, everything. It led to a flood of cheaper, mass-produced goods available to ordinary people.
This sounds like the true birth of the modern factory system as we know it.
It absolutely was. The factory system, with its division of labor, specialized machinery, and mass production of discrete parts for assembly, allowed goods to be manufactured with unprecedented efficiency. These goods could then be shipped via the new transportation networks to regional and distant markets.
And the Lowell system in Massachusetts is often highlighted as a key example of this early factory system.
It's a fascinating and somewhat unique example. Francis Cabot Lowell and his Boston associates established large textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts. They recruited young, unmarried women, mostly from New England farms, famously known as the Lowell Mill Girls, as their primary labor force.
Why young women?
They were seen as a cheap, docile labor source, and factory work was initially presented as a respectable opportunity for them to earn wages before marriage. The company built supervised boarding houses for them, creating a planned factory town. This system, combining work and living quarters under paternalistic control, allowed the U.S. textile industry to rapidly compete with British production. But it also offered a glimpse into the changing nature of work, the rise of wage labor, and new social dynamics, especially for women.
Now, the market revolution didn't just transform industry in the North. It profoundly reshaped agriculture as well, moving it far beyond just feeding the family.
Absolutely. The two were deeply connected. Eli Whitney's other famous invention, the cotton gin, invented way back in 1793, but its impact exploded in this period, significantly sped up the laborious process of separating seeds from short staple cotton bolls.
Which was the kind that could grow inland.
Exactly. This seemingly simple machine had profound and ultimately tragic consequences. It made cotton cultivation incredibly profitable across vast new areas of the South. This fueled a massive expansion of cotton production, king cotton, and chillingly, a dramatic expansion and intensification of slave labor to plant, cultivate, and pick it.
So the gin directly fueled slavery's growth.
Directly and massively. Meanwhile, in the Midwest, other innovations were transforming grain farming. John Deere's steel plow, invented in 1837, had a polished steel surface that could cut through the thick, tough prairie soil without clogging, unlike earlier iron plows. This opened up the vast Midwestern prairies to settlement and large-scale farming, cementing the region's role as the nation's breadbasket, the primary grain-producing region.
And Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper must have dramatically increased harvesting speeds for that grain.
It did, significantly. Invented in the 1830s, the mechanical reaper allowed a farmer to harvest grain far faster, using much less labor than traditional methods with scythes or sickles. This increased agricultural output exponentially. It made large-scale commercial farming truly viable and also contributed to urban population growth as fewer hands were needed on the farms to bring in the harvest.
So the key insight here is this dramatic shift away from subsistence farming.
Yes, from a model where you primarily grew food for your family and maybe traded a small surplus locally to commercial farming. The focus shifted to producing cash crops, cotton in the South, tobacco in the Upper South, wheat and corn in the Midwest, grown primarily for sale and profit in distant, often international markets. Farmers became integrated into this wider market economy, buying more manufactured goods and relying on cash income.
So all these innovations, transportation, industry, agriculture, they fundamentally knitted the different regions of the country together into a more coherent, though specialized, economic system.
Exactly. You saw the emergence of distinct regional specializations that were interdependent. The Erie Canal and the expanding railroad networks linked the industrializing North, which produced manufactured goods like textiles and tools, to the burgeoning Midwest, which supplied grain, livestock, and other foodstuff. This created a powerful economic symbiosis between East and West.
And what about the North-South link? That seems more complicated.
It was deeply complicated and morally fraught. A crucial North-South link emerged primarily through cotton. Southern cotton became the essential raw material fueling the booming textile mills in the North. This created a powerful economic bond even as the regions grew politically and culturally distinct.
So the North was profiting from slavery too.
Immensely. Northern banks financed cotton plantations, Northern insurance companies insured slave property and cotton shipments, and Northern shipping companies transported the cotton to mills in New England and Europe. So the North was deeply financially complicit in the South's slave economy, even as abolitionist sentiment grew there. This economic interdependence made tackling slavery much more difficult.
And this wasn't just an internal economic transformation. You mentioned it very quickly acquired a global reach, connecting the U.S. to international markets.
Without a doubt. Cotton exports in particular were critically important. American cotton supplied the voracious appetite of the booming textile factories in Great Britain, the world's leading industrial power. For decades, cotton was America's single largest export, making the U.S. economy deeply intertwined with the global market, especially Britain.
Beyond cotton.
Yes. U.S. merchant ships also developed robust trade networks carrying other American goods like timber, grain, and tobacco across the Atlantic. They also developed new trade routes sailing around South America to places like Mexico and even across the Pacific to China, carrying American goods and bringing back tea, silk, and other exotic items. The key insight here is that the market revolution not only integrated the U.S. internally, but simultaneously began to position it as a significant player in the expanding global economy of the 19th century.
This immense economic transformation must have had enormous societal and cultural impacts. You mentioned it fueled massive migration, created new social classes, and even fundamentally altered gender roles. Let's dig into that.
It absolutely did. The market revolution, with its demand for labor and creation of new opportunities, fueled massive internal and international migration. Northern cities, in particular, just exploded in size and diversity during this period.
Like Philadelphia.
Philadelphia is a great example. It saw huge influxes of immigrants, especially Irish immigrants, fleeing the devastating potato famine in the 1840s, and also German immigrants escaping crop failures and the aftermath of failed democratic revolutions in Europe around 1848.
And what role did these immigrants play?
They provided crucial, cheap labor for the burgeoning industries, factories, construction, canal digging. They filled the demand for workers created by the revolution.
But with that rapid growth and influx of new people came new challenges, right? Cities weren't really prepared.
Not at all. The influx of immigrants led to serious problems like overcrowding in poor neighborhoods, poor sanitation, disease, and definitely heightened class tensions between the native-born and the newcomers and between different immigrant groups.
But it wasn't all negative, presumably.
No. These immigrants also enriched the urban tapestry, establishing new cultural institutions like synagogues, Catholic churches, German social clubs, Irish pubs, changing the sights, sounds, and smells of American cities. However, this rapid change also sparked a significant nativist backlash.
Nativism, meaning anti-immigrant sentiment.
Exactly. Some existing populations, primarily native-born white Protestants, reacted with fear and hostility, often using stereotypical invective against these new arrivals, particularly targeting Irish Catholics and sometimes German Jews. They feared the immigrants' impact on American culture, their perceived loyalty to the Pope, and competition for jobs. This nativism would become a recurring theme in American history.
And while cities were growing, many Americans were still moving westward, establishing new commercial hubs in the interior.
Yes, absolutely. The westward movement continued relentlessly, creating booming commercial centers along the major transportation routes, especially the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Cincinnati, for example, became known as Porkopolis because of its massive meatpacking industry. It perfectly showcased the synergy between Western agriculture, hogs, river transport, and new industrial processing techniques.
And St. Louis.
St. Louis thrived as a critical river port, strategically located near the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. It became the primary gateway for westward expansion, the starting point for trails leading further west, a bustling nexus of trade, trapping, and migration.
So with this new economic landscape with factories and cities and commercial farms, we also saw the clear emergence of entirely new social classes that hadn't really existed before in the same way.
Absolutely. This is a crucial social outcome of the market revolution. An emerging middle class really took shape, primarily in the northern towns and cities. This class consisted of people like businessmen, managers, professionals, doctors, lawyers, shopkeepers, clerks.
And they had their own distinct culture.
They did. They cultivated distinct social norms and values, often emphasizing things like education for their children, temperance, avoiding excessive alcohol, hard work, discipline, and usually Protestant church affiliation. They also had, for the first time for many, some disposable income for new forms of leisure activities like attending plays, circuses, museums, or buying books and magazines.
And interestingly, your sources mention a black middle class also emerging in some northern cities.
Yes, that's an important point often overlooked. Joseph Wilson's Sketches of the Higher Classes of Colored Society in Philadelphia, published in the 1840s, specifically documents the emergence of a black middle class in northern cities. These were often entrepreneurs, skilled artisans, ministers, teachers, who achieved a degree of prosperity and cultivated refined manners, even amid persistent racism and discrimination they faced daily. It shows that the picture wasn't entirely monolithic.
But this economic growth also dramatically widened the gap between the rich and the poor, didn't it?
Profoundly so. At the very top, a small but increasingly powerful, wealthy business elite emerged: factory owners, merchants, bankers, financiers. They accumulated vast fortunes and began to display their wealth through opulent lifestyles and exclusive institutions, like the elite Philadelphia Club founded in the 1830s. This starkly showcased the growing gap between rich and poor.
And at the other end of the spectrum.
At the other end, you had the growing ranks of the laboring poor. These were the factory workers, canal diggers, dock workers, domestic servants. They faced exceedingly meager wages for grueling workdays, often 12, 13 hours long, 6 days a week, frequently under dangerous and unhealthy conditions. They had little job security and lived precariously close to poverty.
But this exploitation, it didn't go unchallenged. We saw early organized resistance.
Exactly. The harsh realities faced by the laboring poor spurred the first stirrings of organized resistance. The Lowell Female Labor Reform Association, which we mentioned earlier, formed in 1844 by women mill workers, is a crucial example. They organized petitions and even strikes, demanding shorter hours, a 10-hour day, and better working conditions. This was really early, significant labor activism, notably driven by women.
And the Working Men's Party.
Another key example. Formed in Philadelphia in 1829, the Working Men's Party was one of the first labor-oriented political parties in the U.S. It advocated for policies benefiting workers, such as free public education for all children, abolition of debt imprisonment, shorter working hours, and generally better conditions. These were early attempts at class-based political mobilization. The key insight here is that the market revolution, while creating immense wealth and opportunity for some, also generated stark inequalities and the very beginnings of organized class conflict in America.
So this whole process really was, as you said, a major break from Jefferson's ideal of independent yeoman farmers. More and more Americans were working for wages, producing goods for distant markets they'd never see, rather than living autonomously on their own land.
Precisely. It was a fundamental shift in the nature of work and economic life for a large portion of the population. And this economic transformation had a particularly profound impact on gender roles and family structures, giving rise to what historians call the cult of domesticity.
The cult of domesticity, what exactly was that?
It was an ideology heavily promoted in the expanding print culture of the time, in books, magazines, religious sermons, that defined woman's primary purpose and sphere of influence. Her role was seen as being centered entirely within the home. Childbearing, child-rearing, maintaining the household, and significantly, creating a moral and spiritual haven of rest for her husband, shielding him from the corrupting influences of the outside world of commerce and politics.
So it established this idea of separate spheres.
Exactly, a clear separation of public and private spheres. Men belonged in the public world of work, politics, and competition. Women belonged in the private, domestic realm of the home and family. Figures like Lydia Maria Child, a popular writer of the time, emphasized these ideals of female piety, purity, and domesticity, even while simultaneously advocating for improved education for women so they could be better mothers and homemakers.
But that ideal wasn't the reality for all women, especially for those in the emerging laboring classes, was it? That seems like a luxury.
No, not at all, and that's an absolutely critical point to grasp. The cult of domesticity was overwhelmingly a middle-class and upper-class phenomenon. It reflected the aspirations, and sometimes the reality, for women in families who could afford to have the wife not work outside the home.
But many couldn't afford that.
Many women, especially from the laboring classes, immigrant women, and certainly enslaved women in the South, simply couldn't afford the luxury of adhering to this ideal. They had to work outside the home to survive. The Lowell Mill women are a prime example, young farm girls leaving home to work long hours for low wages in factories. Their very existence, and especially their activism at Lowell, showed a growing class consciousness and even a gender consciousness that directly challenged these restrictive domestic ideals.
So there's a tension between the ideal and the reality.
A huge tension. And interestingly, we also see examples, though perhaps less common, of women finding entrepreneurial avenues outside the domestic sphere. The source mentions Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake, a same-sex couple in Vermont who successfully ran a tailoring business together for decades. This shows how some women, through skill and partnership, managed to carve out economic independence despite societal expectations. The real insight here is the inherent contradiction, perhaps even hypocrisy. A society increasingly idealizing feminine domesticity while simultaneously relying on the cheap labor of countless women and children in its factories and workshops to fuel the market revolution.
Fascinating. Okay, so as the economy was revolutionizing, America was also wrestling with its ideals of democracy, expanding who could participate politically while simultaneously grappling with the dark reality of indigenous removal and the ever-present, ever-growing issue of slavery. Let's delve into these deepening divides and expanding voices in the next section.
Sounds good. This is where things get really contentious politically.
Absolutely. So the primary driver for expanding participatory democracy during this period was, as you mentioned earlier, the dramatic elimination of property qualifications for voting.
Yes, that's the key change. This led, over several decades, to what we often call universal white male suffrage. It wasn't universal for everyone, obviously, but for white men, the economic barriers to voting largely disappeared. Suddenly, your wealth or lack thereof didn't necessarily bar you from the ballot box, and that fundamentally reshapes the political landscape.
So what fueled this demand for a broader franchise? It wasn't just the elite deciding to be generous, was it?
Oh, definitely not. It was driven by powerful demands from below. Small farmers, working men in the growing cities, settlers on the frontier, many of whom were struggling economically, they actively pushed for the right to vote. They wanted accountability from their leaders. They wanted policies that addressed their concerns.
And the Panic of 1819 played a role.
A big role. This was the first major financial crisis in the U.S. It was caused by factors like irresponsible banking practices, speculation in Western lands, and a sudden drop in exports after the Napoleonic Wars. It led to widespread bank failures, unemployment, and foreclosures. This economic hardship fueled a populist anger, making laboring men, especially in the newer Western states, demand more direct political say. They blamed banks, elites, and politicians and wanted the power to vote them out.
And the newer Western states seemed to set a precedent for suffrage, didn't they? They were often more egalitarian from the start.
They absolutely did. Many Western states, when they joined the Union, wrote constitutions that already included universal or near-universal white male suffrage without the property requirements common in the older Eastern states. This put significant pressure on the Eastern states to follow suit, as they risked losing population and political influence if they seemed less democratic.
Is there a good example of this pressure leading to change?
A really vivid example is the Dorr Rebellion in Rhode Island, which happened a bit later, from 1841 to 1842, but it perfectly illustrates the pressure. Rhode Island still operated under its old colonial charter, which had very strict property requirements, disenfranchising a majority of the state's white men. Frustrated ordinary citizens, led by Thomas Dorr, held their own People's Convention, drafted a new, more democratic constitution, and tried to set up a rival government.
A rebellion for voting rights.
Essentially, yes. Though the rebellion itself was militarily suppressed pretty quickly, it successfully pressured the established government. They realized they couldn't ignore the popular demand, and they adopted a new state constitution in 1843 that drastically expanded voting rights to nearly all white men, eliminating the property qualification for native-born citizens.
So what were the overall effects of this massive expansion of suffrage across the country?
By about 1825 or so, most Eastern states had either substantially lowered or entirely eliminated property qualifications for voting for white men. This resulted in a huge increase in voter turnout, a massive expansion in the number of people participating directly in politics. It fundamentally shifted the nation away from the more elitist republicanism envisioned by many of the Founding Fathers, where voting was seen as a privilege for property owners, towards what became known as Jacksonian democracy. This was a much more populist, mass participatory political culture centered around popular campaigning, party organization, and appealing directly to the common man.
This expansion of democracy coincided with a significant political realignment. You mentioned the Federalist Party had essentially crumbled after the War of 1812, leaving the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson's party, as the sole national party for a time, the era of good feelings. But that unity didn't last long.
No, it fragmented remarkably quickly, actually. The good feelings were pretty superficial. Underlying economic turmoil, like the Panic of 1819 and the growing demands for broader suffrage, combined with sectional tensions over issues like tariffs and slavery, caused the Democratic Republicans to splinter into competing factions.
And these factions became new parties.
Essentially, yes. By the 1820s, two clear factions emerged. You had the Democrats, coalescing around the popular military hero Andrew Jackson. They generally championed limited federal government, states' rights, and strict constructionism, closer to the original Jeffersonian ideal. And then you had the National Republicans, led by figures like Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. They absorbed many old Federalist ideas, advocating for an active, expansive federal government promoting economic development through things like the American system, a national bank, internal improvements, protective tariffs. They favored loose constructionism.
This splintering really came to a head in the incredibly contentious election of 1824, didn't it? The one with four major candidates.
It did. It was a messy election. You had John Quincy Adams from the North, Henry Clay from the West, William Crawford from the South, representing the Old Guard, and Andrew Jackson, also from the West-South, the popular hero.
And Jackson won the popular vote.
Jackson won the popular vote and the most electoral votes, but crucially, no candidate secured an outright majority in the Electoral College. This threw the decision, according to the Constitution, into the House of Representatives, where they had to choose among the top three finishers: Crawford, Adams, Jackson.
And Henry Clay, who had come in fourth and was out of the running, happened to be the Speaker of the House.
Exactly. Clay wielded considerable influence. He personally disliked Jackson, and his political principles aligned more closely with Adams's national Republican views. So Clay threw his crucial support behind John Quincy Adams, leading to Adams's election by the House.
Okay, fair enough according to the rules. But then Adams made a fateful appointment.
Yes. Shortly after taking office, Adams named Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. This position was widely seen at the time as the stepping stone to the presidency. Jackson and his furious followers immediately cried foul, claiming a corrupt bargain. They alleged that Clay had sold his support to Adams in exchange for the prestigious appointment.
Was there proof of a bargain?
No concrete proof has ever emerged that there was an explicit deal. It might have just been political alignment, but the appearance was terrible. The accusation, though perhaps unfounded, resonated powerfully with the public, fueled immense popular discontent against Adams and Clay, and irrevocably hardened the emerging party divide. It basically launched Jackson's campaign for the next election immediately and laid the groundwork for a much nastier political era.
And by 1828, these factions had fully solidified into the new two-party system that would dominate the next few decades. The Democrats, led by Jackson, and the Whigs, coalescing around Clay and Adams' supporters. This really defined the Jacksonian era.
That's right, the second party system.
And these parties clashed fiercely over the role and scope of federal power, especially concerning those core issues from Henry Clay's American system, the bank, internal improvements, and tariffs.
These became the absolute defining battlegrounds of the era. The Democrats, under Andrew Jackson, generally stood for limited federal power, states' rights, free trade, and were often skeptical of banks and corporations. They drew support from farmers, urban workers, immigrants, and frontier settlers, often portraying themselves as the party of the common man against the elites.
And the Whigs?
The Whigs, led by figures like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, generally championed a more vigorous, active central government. They strongly supported a national bank, protective tariffs to foster industry, and federally funded internal improvements to knit the country together and promote economic growth. They essentially picked up the mantle of the old Federalists and National Republicans, drawing support from businessmen, merchants, some large planters in the South, and reformers in the North.
Okay, let's break down their fights over Biddy. Starting with B, the national bank. Jackson was famously fiercely opposed to the second bank of the U.S. Why was that such a central, almost personal issue for him?
Jackson had a deep, visceral distrust of banks in general, stemming partly from his own earlier financial troubles. He viewed the Second Bank of the United States, a private corporation with a federal charter and significant power over the nation's currency and credit, as unconstitutional. He also believed it concentrated too much power in the hands of a privileged few, an unelected financial elite, and that it propped up the wealthy at the expense of the common people, farmers, and laborers. For him, it symbolized aristocratic privilege and corruption.
So when his charter came up for renewal,
He vetoed it. The bank's charter wasn't due to expire until 1836, but Henry Clay and Nicholas Biddle, the bank's president, decided to push for early recharter in 1832, hoping to make it an election issue they thought Jackson couldn't win. It backfired spectacularly. Jackson issued a powerful veto message denouncing the bank as a monster, a hydra of corruption, and painting his veto as a victory for the common man against entrenched interests.
and the public reaction.
It was incredibly popular. His veto message resonated widely, and he won a landslide re-election in 1832 over Clay. His victory was seen as a popular mandate against the bank. Jackson then proceeded to withdraw federal funds from the bank and deposit them in various state banks, often called pet banks, effectively killing the national bank even before its charter expired. This was a profound assertion of executive power against both Congress and a powerful economic institution.
Wow. Okay, moving to federally funded internal improvements. Roads, canals, infrastructure. That was another flashpoint.
Indeed. Whigs, like John Quincy Adams before Jackson and Clay during this period, consistently championed federal spending on infrastructure. They saw projects like the Cumberland Road, canals, dredging harbors, building lighthouses as essential for national unity, economic development, and binding the different regions together. It was central to their vision of an active, modernizing government.
But the Democrats disagreed.
Democrats, particularly Jackson, generally viewed federal funding for such projects as a dangerous federal overreach and often unconstitutional unless the project clearly served a national rather than local purpose, like coastal defense. Jackson famously vetoed the Maysville Road Bill in 1830, which would have funded a road entirely within Kentucky, arguing it was a purely local matter and should be state-funded. This reflected the persistent Democratic emphasis on states' rights and limited federal spending.
And finally, tariffs, taxes on imported goods. These remained incredibly controversial, and the tariff of 1828 sounds like it truly lived up to his nickname, the Tariff of Abominations.
It certainly did, especially in the South. This tariff, passed under President John Quincy Adams but inherited by Jackson, significantly raised duties on a wide range of imported goods. It was designed to protect northern manufacturers and also gain support from some western farmers who benefited from duties on things like raw wool and hemp.
But the South hated it.
Absolutely despised it. The South, with its export-oriented agricultural economy and reliance on imported manufactured goods, felt it severely disadvantaged them. It raised the cost of goods they needed to buy while potentially hurting their cotton exports if Britain retaliated with its own tariffs. They saw it as a blatant sectional legislation benefiting the North at the South's expense. This economic grievance led directly to the nullification crisis.
Right. Where South Carolina, led by John C. Calhoun, who was actually Jackson's vice president at the time, argued that states had the right to nullify or void federal laws they deemed unconstitutional within their borders.
Yes. Calhoun, a brilliant political theorist but now fiercely dedicated to defending Southern interests and slavery, developed the doctrine of nullification in response to the Tariff of Abominations. South Carolina officially nullified the tariffs of 1828 and 1832, forbidding their collection in the state and threatening secession if the federal government tried to use force.
How did Jackson respond to this challenge from his own VP and a Southern state?
Jackson, despite being a proponent of states' rights generally, was also a fierce nationalist who believed the Union was paramount. He saw nullification as treason. He responded forcefully, issuing a proclamation to the people of South Carolina denouncing nullification as unconstitutional and warning against secession. He also asked Congress for and received the Force Bill in 1833, which explicitly authorized him to use military force to enforce federal laws in South Carolina if necessary.
So military confrontation seemed possible.
It did, for a tense period. However, conflict was averted by another compromise, engineered largely by Henry Clay. Congress passed a new tariff bill that gradually reduced the tariff rates over several years, appeasing the South. South Carolina then withdrew its nullification of the tariffs, but in a final act of defiance, nullified the Force Bill itself, which was now moot.
What's the significance of this whole crisis?
It demonstrates a deeply dangerous ideological rift over the nature of the Union states' rights versus federal authority. While Jackson upheld federal supremacy in this instance, the underlying questions about sovereignty, secession, and the protection of minority interests, in this case the slaveholding South, were left unresolved, powerfully foreshadowing the ultimate conflict of the Civil War.
Beyond these intense political battles over federal power, the era was also marked by relentless westward expansion, which, as we know, meant tragedy and resilient resistance for the indigenous populations already living there. Frontier settlers, your sources note, were huge champions of this expansion.
They absolutely were. Figures like John Dougherty, an Indian agent and fur trader, articulated the popular sentiment among many white Americans. Westward expansion was natural, inevitable, even divinely ordained. It meant access to cheap land, new economic opportunities, and the fulfillment of America's perceived manifest destiny to spread across the continent.
But this vision came at a devastating cost to Native Americans.
A horrific cost. The official policy shifted decisively towards removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, strongly pushed by President Jackson, formally mandated the forced relocation of all remaining Native American tribes in the eastern states to lands west of the Mississippi River, primarily to what was designated as Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. This policy was driven by an insatiable desire for native lands, especially fertile cotton land in the southeast, a desire exacerbated by the discovery of gold on Cherokee lands in Georgia.
And the Supreme Court in Worcester v. Georgia in 1832 actually sided with the Cherokees against Georgia's attempts to seize their land.
They did. In a landmark ruling, Chief Justice John Marshall stated that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community within which the laws of Georgia can have no force. He affirmed that Georgia had no right to impose its laws within Cherokee boundaries because their lands were federally protected by treaties and they had a degree of sovereignty.
But did that ruling stop the removal?
Tragically, no. In a stark and infamous display of executive defiance of the judiciary, President Jackson allegedly disregarded the ruling, famously reputed to have said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." While he might not have said those exact words, his administration certainly acted in defiance of the spirit, if not the letter, of the ruling.
So what happened?
The administration continued to pressure the Cherokees and other southeastern tribes. Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, the 5 civilized tribes. They negotiated the Treaty of New Echota in 1835 with a small, unauthorized faction of the Cherokee Nation, exchanging eastern lands for territory in the west. Though vehemently opposed by the vast majority of Cherokees led by Principal Chief John Ross, the treaty was ratified by the U.S. Senate.
And this led to the Trail of Tears.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Based on this illegitimate treaty, the U.S. Army, under Jackson's successor Martin Van Buren, began forcibly removing the Cherokees in 1838. Thousands were rounded up, held in internment camps, and then forced to march west during harsh conditions, often with inadequate food, shelter, or protection. Due to disease, starvation, and exposure during the ill-prepared removal, historians estimate that somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 Cherokee people, perhaps a quarter of the nation, died on what became known as the Trail of Tears. Similar forced removals happened to the other southeastern tribes as well. It's a brutal chapter in American history.
But indigenous groups didn't just passively accept these policies. They resisted in various ways.
Fiercely and courageously, yes, though often tragically unsuccessfully against overwhelming force. There were notable armed resistance efforts, such as the Black Hawk War in 1832. The Sauk leader, Black Hawk, led his people back across the Mississippi into Illinois to reclaim their ancestral lands, but they were brutally defeated by U.S. troops and militia.
And the Seminoles in Florida.
The Seminoles waged a long and costly guerrilla war against removal, known as the Second Seminole War, 1835-1842, led by figures like Osceola. They utilized the Florida swamps effectively, but were eventually largely defeated and removed, though some managed to remain hidden in the Everglades. Earlier, General Andrew Jackson himself had defeated the Creek Nation in the Creek War, 1813-1814, forcing them to cede vast territories.
And there was non-military resistance, too.
Absolutely. John Ross, the principal chief of the Cherokees, consistently resisted removal through legal and political means for decades. He tirelessly lobbied Congress, challenged Georgia's laws in court, leading to Cherokee Nation v. Georgia and Worcester v. Georgia, and tried to negotiate fair treaties representing the majority Cherokee will against removal. And even before this period, figures like Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee Prophet, had organized a powerful multi-tribal confederacy in the Ohio Valley to resist U.S. expansion, culminating in their defeat at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, which broke the back of that resistance movement.
It really raises that powerful question you mentioned. What might have been different if the Supreme Court's ruling in Worcester v. Georgia, which affirmed Cherokee sovereignty, had actually been upheld and, crucially, enforced by the executive branch?
It's a profound what-if. Would the trajectory of U.S. indigenous relations, the very map of the United States, and indeed the moral arc of American history, have been irrevocably altered? It's impossible to know, but it highlights the tragic consequences when the rule of law was ignored in favor of expansion and popular pressure.
A sobering thought. Okay. Alongside these intense political and territorial conflicts, America also experienced a massive spiritual transformation during this period, the Second Great Awakening. What was this all about, and how did it change American society?
The Second Great Awakening was a period of intense Protestant religious revivals that swept across the nation, starting around 1800 and continuing for decades. It was characterized by a strong emphasis on personal conversion, righteous living, personal restraint, and a strong moral rectitude as the pathway to individual salvation.
How is it different from the First Great Awakening back in the colonial era?
It was generally much more emotional, more democratic in spirit, and more focused on social reform. Unlike the earlier, often more intellectual or theological awakening, this one spread rapidly through highly emotional and inclusive gatherings, particularly the famous camp meetings. These were often held in frontier areas, lasting for days, where multiple preachers from different denominations might speak to vast, diverse crowds, sometimes numbering in the thousands.
So what were the key causes that fueled this widespread spiritual fire? Why did it happen then?
Several factors converged. Firstly, the rising democratic and individualistic beliefs of the Jacksonian era definitely extended into the spiritual realm. The egalitarian nature of the camp meetings, which often welcomed whites and blacks, enslaved and free, men and women, rich and poor, really resonated with the common person who felt empowered to choose their own faith.
Okay, so democracy influenced religion.
Yes. Secondly, there was a broader cultural shift away from the Enlightenment's emphasis on rationalism towards Romanticism, which valued emotion, intuition, and personal experience. This was reflected in the preaching style. Preachers like Charles Grandison Finney used deliberately emotionally charged sermons, dramatic language, and direct appeals to the heart, moving away from dense theological arguments towards more relatable, passionate calls for immediate conversion and repentance.
So it really tapped into people's feelings and personal experiences much more directly.
Exactly. And thirdly, the market revolution's influence itself played a significant, perhaps subtle role. The growing belief in individual economic agency, the idea that you could shape your own prosperity through hard work and enterprise, found a powerful spiritual parallel. Preachers increasingly told devotees that salvation was in their hands through moral choices, good works, and personal faith. This emphasis on free will and individual responsibility for salvation was a stark contrast to the older Calvinist doctrines of predestination that had been prominent during the First Great Awakening. It empowered individuals to believe they could actively choose and achieve their own spiritual fate.
So this focus on individual choice, moral striving, and the potential for improvement, it sounds like it naturally laid the groundwork for a broader age of reform in society as well.
It absolutely did. That's one of the most important consequences of the Second Great Awakening. Key figures emerged from this fervor who became leaders not just in religion, but in reform. Charles Grandison Finney, perhaps the most famous revivalist of the era, pioneered this less cerebral, more emotional preaching style. He also promoted perfectionism, the radical idea for the time that humans could achieve moral perfection and strive towards a sinless life on earth through conversion and disciplined effort. This belief fueled many reform movements.
Who else was important?
Peter Cartwright was another key figure, a tireless Methodist circuit rider who brought this passionate, plain-spoken revivalism directly to the frontier communities, converting thousands.
And we also saw the emergence of significant new religious institutions and movements during this time, especially for African Americans.
Yes, very importantly. The African Methodist Episcopal, AME Church, formerly founded by Richard Allen in Philadelphia in 1816, grew rapidly during this period. It provided crucial religious autonomy and leadership opportunities for African Americans, free and enslaved, who often faced discrimination in white-dominated churches. The AME Church quickly became a vital center for community organizing, education, and, significantly, the burgeoning abolitionist movement. It featured powerful preachers and activists, including figures like Harry Hosier, known for his eloquence, and Jarena Lee, who defied convention to become the first authorized female preacher in the AME Church.
And other new religious movements sprang up too.
Yes, the intense spiritual energy, especially in areas like upstate New York, which became known as the Burned-Over District because it had been swept by so many waves of religious revival, proved fertile ground for entirely new religious movements. Most notably, Mormonism, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was founded by Joseph Smith during this period, based on his claimed revelations. Millerism, led by William Miller, predicted the imminent second coming of Christ, attracting many followers before the predicted date passed. These movements reflected the era's spiritual ferment and quest for new forms of faith and community.
So it's clear this Second Great Awakening truly ignited what historians call an age of reform. People weren't just focused on personal salvation. They actively sought to improve individuals and society as a whole. What were the main themes or targets of these reform movements?
The driving forces we've discussed, the market revolution creating new social problems, democratic ideals empowering ordinary people, and the Second Great Awakening providing the moral, fervor, and organizational framework, all combined to create this powerful gospel of improvement. It extended beyond personal salvation to tackling perceived societal sins and imperfections. The main themes that emerged were efforts focused on religious and utopian experiments, the temperance movement against alcohol, the abolitionist movement against slavery, and the burgeoning women's rights movement.
Let's start with those religious and utopian movements. What were they trying to achieve?
Mormonism, as we mentioned, sought to establish a new religious community based on Smith's teachings. They faced intense persecution, largely due to their practice of polygamy and their communal economic practices, which led Brigham Young, after Smith's murder, to famously lead the community on a long, arduous migration to establish their Zion in the Utah Territory, seeking refuge and autonomy.
And the other utopian communities?
Beyond the Mormons, numerous smaller utopian communities sprang up, directly inspired by the Second Great Awakening's perfectionist ideals and the broader romantic belief in human perfectibility. Examples include the Shakers, known for their communal living, strict celibacy, emotional worship services, and simple functional design. Brook Farm, near Boston, was a famous transcendentalist community that attempted to balance intellectual pursuits with manual labor, though it ultimately failed financially. Even more radical ventures like Fruitlands, founded by Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's father, emphasized extreme self-sufficiency and spiritual purity. These were all attempts, in different ways, to create ideal societies on Earth, separate from the perceived corruption of mainstream society.
The temperance movement was also absolutely huge during this period, wasn't it? You mentioned earlier that average alcohol consumption was incredibly high.
Staggeringly high, yes. Estimates suggest that for adult men who drank, the average consumption in the 1820s was about 5 gallons of hard liquor per person per year, plus beer and wine. Alcohol abuse was seen as a major source of social problems: poverty, crime, domestic violence, workplace accidents.
So the movement aimed to reduce or eliminate alcohol consumption.
Exactly. The American Temperance Society, founded in 1826 largely by clergy and concerned businessmen, grew rapidly into a massive national movement, with hundreds of thousands of members pledging to abstain from distilled spirits and later from all alcoholic beverages. It primarily targeted working-class men, but gained significant support from factory owners who believed temperance would dramatically increase worker productivity and reliability. Women were also highly active, forming groups like the Daughters of Temperance, seeing alcohol as a threat to the home and family.
Was it universally popular?
Not entirely. While it had broad support among middle-class Protestants, many newly arrived Irish and German immigrants, for whom drinking was often an important part of their cultural traditions, largely rejected the movement, sometimes seeing it as nativist prejudice disguised as moral reform.
Okay, and then, of course, there were the incredibly important abolitionist and anti-slavery movements, which fundamentally challenged the moral fabric of the nation by attacking slavery. For them, slavery was unequivocally a sinful institution.
This movement gained enormous momentum during this period, fueled directly by the moral fervor of the Second Great Awakening. It ranged from advocating for gradual, compensated emancipation and colonization, sending freed slaves back to Africa, to much more radical calls for immediate, uncompensated abolition. The core conviction, however, was that slavery was a grave sin that needed to be eradicated.
Who were some of the key figures driving this movement?
Several incredibly powerful voices emerged. William Lloyd Garrison was perhaps the most famous radical white abolitionist. He published the uncompromising anti-slavery newspaper The Liberator, starting in 1831, and founded the influential American Anti-Slavery Society. He advocated for immediate abolition based on moral persuasion and was famously uncompromising, even publicly burning the Constitution, calling it a covenant with death and an agreement with hell because of its protections for slavery.
And Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in Maryland, became arguably the most powerful voice in the movement. He was a magnificent orator and a brilliant writer. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, published in 1845, was a bestseller that vividly exposed the brutality and dehumanization of slavery through his own searing personal experience. He became a towering figure advocating for abolition and racial equality.
And there were other powerful voices, some perhaps unexpected, like the Grimke sisters from the South.
Yes, Sarah and Angelina Grimke were truly remarkable. They were daughters of a prominent South Carolina slaveholding family who became Quakers and then outspoken abolitionists and, crucially, pioneers in the women's rights movement. Their firsthand testimony against slavery was incredibly powerful, and their fight for the right to speak publicly as women directly linked the abolitionist and women's rights causes.
Who else contributed significantly?
David Walker, a free black man in Boston, published his fiery appeal to the colored citizens of the world in 1829, which called for immediate abolition and explicitly urged enslaved people to resist their bondage, even violently if necessary. It terrified slaveholders. Even legal cases, like the famous Amistad case in 1841, became rallying points. Abolitionists successfully defended a group of enslaved Africans who had revolted on a Spanish slave ship, arguing for their freedom before the Supreme Court, where they were represented by former President John Quincy Adams. The victory linked abolitionist efforts to legal arguments and Christian principles against the injustice of the slave trade and slavery itself.
What was the impact of these movements in this period?
While immediate abolition wasn't achieved, the movement grew significantly, put slavery at the center of national debate, and contributed to the gradual emancipation process that had already been completed or was underway in the northern states. It also fostered the growth of a significant free African American population, primarily in the North, though even there, their rights and opportunities remained severely restricted by pervasive racism.
It seems like the women's rights movement really grew directly out of the abolitionist movement, almost like a parallel struggle. Women, fighting for the freedom of others, began to realize and articulate their own lack of freedom and rights.
That's precisely the insight historians often draw. Many women who became active in abolitionism, attending meetings, circulating petitions, speaking out quickly, ran into societal barriers based on their gender. They were often told it wasn't proper for women to engage in public or political activity. They acutely recognized the parallels between the legal and social limitations placed on enslaved people and their own restricted status within society, particularly the constraints imposed by the cult of domesticity.
So their fight against slavery eliminated their own subjugation.
Exactly. This realization culminated in the landmark Seneca Falls Convention in upstate New York in 1848. Organized primarily by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, both of whom had been involved in the abolitionist movement, and were famously barred from participating fully in an international anti-slavery convention in London because they were women. This was the first convention specifically organized to discuss women's rights.
And they issued the Declaration of Sentiments.
Yes, its most famous product was the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, brilliantly modeled on the Declaration of Independence. It boldly declared that all men and women are created equal, and went on to list a powerful litany of grievances against a male-dominated society that denied women's suffrage, property rights, educational opportunities, and equality under the law. It was a radical call for equality.
So a clear, unequivocal statement demanding equality, not just for enslaved people, but for women too.
Exactly. Figures like Mary McClintock, Martha Coffin Wright, Mott's sister, and early Black feminist voices like Maria W. Stewart were also central to this burgeoning movement. Though it's important to acknowledge, as the movement progressed, internal debates and tensions later emerged, particularly after the Civil War, over strategy and priorities, including difficult arguments over whether to focus primarily on suffrage for white women versus advocating for universal suffrage, including Black men. These complexities shouldn't be overlooked.
Were there other significant reform movements happening during this time as well?
Yes, the spirit of reform touched many areas. Education saw efforts like those of Thomas Gallaudet and Laurent Clerc, who established the first American school for the deaf in Hartford, Connecticut, pioneering deaf education. Dorothea Dix launched a tireless crusade to expose the horrific conditions in asylums and prisons, advocating for humane treatment of the mentally ill, leading to significant reforms in many states. And figures like William Ape, a Pequot Methodist minister, argued passionately for Native American rights, citizenship, and equality, challenging the racism inherent in removal policies. The core insight is that this period, fueled by that evangelical zeal for perfection and those democratic ideals, truly embodied a pervasive belief in improvement. Americans sought to perfect not just themselves, but their families, their communities, and their entire society, leading to this incredible flourishing of reform movements, even amidst the nation's profound contradictions.
Now, let's turn our attention specifically to the South, a region that developed a very distinct identity during this period, shaped deeply by its unique geographic factors, its overwhelming reliance on staple crops like cotton, and of course the centrality of the enduring institution of slavery. But first, let's just briefly touch on the broader development of a distinct American culture that was simultaneously emerging across the nation during this Romantic era.
Right. It's crucial to understand this cultural shift happening concurrently. There was a conscious effort, really, a move away from the rationalism and order of the European Enlightenment that had influenced the founding generation towards the tenets of Romanticism, emphasizing emotion, individualism, intuition, and often a deep reverence for nature. For decades, American culture had largely looked to Europe for its models, but now we see a deliberate effort to forge a unique national identity in art, literature, philosophy, even language.
Like in literature, you have Noah Webster publishing his American Dictionary of the English Language in 1828. That seems like a very deliberate act of cultural independence.
Absolutely. It was a conscious effort to standardize American spelling and usage, actively fostering a distinct national linguistic identity and differentiating American English from British English. It was part of creating an American voice.
And we see that voice emerging in fiction writers, too.
Definitely. You have authors like Washington Irving, who became internationally famous with stories like Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He skillfully blended European romantic themes with uniquely American folklore, settings, and character types. James Fenimore Cooper, in novels like The Last of the Mohicans, romanticized the American frontier and the noble savage archetype, creating iconic American heroes like Natty Bumppo and shaping perceptions of the West.
And Edgar Allan Poe.
Poe represented a darker side of Romanticism, delving into themes of mystery, the macabre, and the complex psychological inner world, exploring the depths of human emotion and obsession. Even narratives by formerly enslaved people, like the one by Leonard Black mentioned in the sources, sometimes drew on these romantic ideals of individual freedom, inherent worth, and the power of personal experience to fuel the abolitionist cause.
And in art, the Hudson River School became really central to this emerging American identity, didn't it? Focusing on grand American landscapes.
Yes, the Hudson River School painters, Artists like Thomas Cole, Asher Duran, and sometimes including African-American painters working in the same tradition like Robert Duncanson, became famous for their large, dramatic canvases depicting the American wilderness, particularly the Hudson River Valley, the Catskills, and later the West. Their work expressed a profound romantic reverence for the power and beauty of nature, often imbued with a sense of moral or spiritual significance, and reflected a burgeoning belief in America's unique landscape and destiny.
Often showing nature as vast and overwhelming compared to humans.
Exactly, though sometimes their paintings also included subtle hints of encroaching civilization. A distant train, a cleared field, perhaps reflecting an ambivalence about the changes wrought by expansion and the market revolution. Philosophically, Transcendentalism emerged during this time as a uniquely American offshoot of Romanticism, deeply rooted in finding spiritual truth in nature and emphasizing intuition over reason and the inherent goodness and perfectibility of the individual.
And the key figures here were based around Concord, Massachusetts, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry David Thoreau.
Yes, Emerson, a former Unitarian minister, became the leading voice of Transcendentalism through his essays and lectures, famously preaching doctrines of individualism, self-reliance, nonconformity, and finding the divine, the oversoul, directly in nature and within oneself. Henry David Thoreau, Emerson's friend and disciple, put these ideas into practice with his famous experiment living simply at Walden Pond for 2 years, chronicled in his book, Walden. He also advocated for civil disobedience against unjust laws, like those supporting slavery or the Mexican War, in his influential essay, Resistance to Civil Government.
And Margaret Fuller was also a key transcendentalist.
Absolutely. Margaret Fuller was a brilliant writer, critic, and editor associated with the Transcendentalist Circle. She became a leading feminist voice of the era, arguing powerfully for women's intellectual and personal freedom, challenging traditional gender roles in her groundbreaking book, Woman in the 19th Century, 1845.
And even in architecture, we saw a conscious shift away from British styles.
Yes, a deliberate move away from the British Georgian styles popular in the colonial era towards neoclassical architecture. This involved borrowing forms inspired by ancient Greece and Rome columns, domes, symmetrical facades. It was a conscious choice to visually embody the ideals of the young republic democracy from Greece, republican virtue from Rome, permanence, order, and a romantic sense of grandeur and awe. You see this in iconic buildings like the U.S. Capitol, state capitals, banks, even private homes. It was about creating a distinctly American classical style.
And this belief in human perfectibility also connects back to those utopian communities we discussed earlier, right?
Yeah.
Shakers, Oneida, Brook Farm.
Exactly. They were direct attempts to put these romantic and perfectionist ideals into practice, to create model societies based on principles of cooperation, equality, and substantial harmony, trying to achieve human perfectibility here on Earth.
Okay, now let's return specifically to the South. Geographic and environmental factors seem to have profoundly shaped its development, particularly leading to its enduring reliance on staple crops like cotton and tobacco.
Absolutely. Geography and environment were key. One critical factor, particularly in the older southern states like Virginia and the Carolinas, was the legacy of overcultivation, especially of tobacco, which rapidly depleted the nutrients in the soil, making the land less productive over time.
So the land was wearing out.
Yes. This depletion of arable land in the Southeast became a major push factor, encouraging slaveholders to look westward. They aggressively relocated their plantations, along with hundreds of thousands of enslaved people, to the more fertile lands becoming available west of the Appalachian Mountains in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. This westward migration, driven by the search for fresh land, directly fueled the continued growth and geographic expansion of the institution of slavery, especially as cotton cultivation exploded in these new territories, becoming king.
And this overwhelming reliance on just a few agricultural staples, primarily cotton, created a very distinct Southern regional identity.
It really did. While the North was diversifying its economy with manufacturing, finance, and commerce, Southern business leaders and the planter elite continued to rely heavily on the production and export of traditional agricultural staples. Cotton, in particular, became the absolute bedrock of the Southern economy and, increasingly, its culture and political identity. This fostered a distinctive Southern regional identity deeply tied to this agrarian, slave-based plantation system, making the South increasingly resistant to the economic and social changes sweeping the North and West. They saw themselves as fundamentally different.
Now, it's often assumed, or at least pictured, that most white Southerners were wealthy planters living on large plantations with many slaves. But the sources emphasize that wasn't actually the case, was it?
No, that's a crucial misconception, often perpetuated by romanticized images of the Old South. In reality, the majority of white Southerners owned no enslaved persons at all. The largest single group of white Southerners were yeoman farmers, people who owned and worked their own small farms, perhaps with family labor, growing food for themselves and maybe a small amount of cash crops.
Did these non-slaveholders oppose slavery?
It varied. While most generally accepted the institution of slavery as part of the social order and benefited indirectly from the racial hierarchy, some yeoman farmers, particularly those on the western frontier or in upland areas less suited to plantation agriculture, did resent the political and economic dominance of the planter class. Some even recognized how the competition from unpaid enslaved labor could economically disadvantage them, and occasionally called for gradual abolition or reforms. However, their efforts to challenge the system through state legislatures were largely unsuccessful due to the overwhelming political and economic power wielded by the planter elite.
So how did this planter elite, despite being a numerical minority, maybe only 25% of white families owned any slaves, and far fewer owned large numbers, manage to successfully unify the larger population of Southern whites, including the non-slaveholding majority, under their economic and political control? How did they maintain dominance?
They employed several powerful strategies, both structural and ideological. Politically, the Three-Fifths Compromise, enshrined in the Constitution, gave slave states disproportionate representation in the House of Representatives and thus extra weight in the Electoral College, allowing a relatively tiny number of elite slaveholders to wield immense national political influence far beyond their numbers. Within the South, property qualifications for voting and office holding often favored wealthier landowners.
And economically, how did they tie poor whites to the system?
Economically, planters often controlled local markets, gins, and transportation. They might provide crucial loans, seasonal work, or access to markets for poorer white farmers, creating direct economic dependencies and incentives for non-slaveholders to support or at least acquiesce to the existing system dominated by the planters. Kinship ties also played a role.
And perhaps most powerfully, they cultivated and weaponized the ideology of white supremacy.
This became increasingly central, especially from the 1830s onward as abolitionist pressure mounted. Planters consciously worked to coalesce white society, regardless of class, around the ideology of white supremacy. It provided a powerful, unifying common ground. By constantly asserting the inherent superiority of the white race, and the supposed inferiority and danger of black people, they created a powerful racial solidarity that aimed to trump potential class divisions among whites. Poor whites might not own slaves, but they were assured they were racially superior and part of the ruling race, giving them a psychological stake in maintaining the system.
The pro-slavery arguments themselves also shifted during this period, becoming much more aggressive and elaborate, moving beyond simply calling it a necessary evil.
Absolutely. There was a distinct and very significant intellectual shift. The founders' generation often express, at least privately, tortured moral reservations about slavery, frequently deeming it a necessary evil inherited from the past that they hoped would eventually wither away. But by the 1830s, facing growing abolitionist attacks from the North and slave revolts like Nat Turner's, Southern intellectuals and politicians began to mount a vigorous, aggressive defense of slavery as a positive good.
A positive good. How could they argue that?
Figures like South Carolina's John C. Calhoun became leading proponents of this view. They argued that slavery was not only essential for the Southern economy, which was true, but that it provided a stable racial hierarchy necessary for social order. They claimed it benefited the enslaved people themselves by providing them with care, discipline, and exposure to Christianity, supposedly civilizing them. Calhoun famously asserted that no wealthy and civilized society had ever existed without one portion of the population living on the labor of another, attempting to normalize slavery as a natural, even beneficial, social arrangement. He argued that the mastery of the white race over the black race was the essential foundation holding Southern society together and preventing race war.
But were there other, perhaps more nuanced or unusual pro-slavery arguments being made too?
Indeed. The sources mention Zephaniah Kingsley, a wealthy Florida planter, who offers a fascinating, if morally complex, counterpoint. While he vigorously defended slavery on economic grounds, arguing it was necessary for cultivating tropical crops, he also advocated for more flexible racial boundaries based on class rather than solely on race. He even openly married an African woman he had formerly enslaved, recognized their mixed-race children, and argued for a three-tiered social system, whites, free people of color, slaves, similar to some Caribbean colonies. This highlights the diversity of pro-slavery arguments and the fact that the defense wasn't entirely monolithic, even if the outcome was the same, upholding the institution.
And external pressure seemed to make the South dig in its heels even more.
Yes. The growing global movement toward abolition, highlighted by Britain's emancipation of slaves in its West Indian colonies in 1834, along with the increasingly vocal abolitionist movement in the North, paradoxically intensified the defense of slavery in the South. Instead of considering reform, the planter class became more rigid, more defensive, and more determined to protect their peculiar institution at all costs, viewing any criticism as an attack on their entire way of life.
Amidst all this, the economic reliance, the political dominance of planters, the aggressive pro-slavery arguments, African Americans, both enslaved and free, faced pervasive dehumanization. Yet they demonstrated incredibly resilient forms of resistance, from subtle daily acts to overt organized rebellion.
The daily reality for most enslaved people was one of immense suffering, coercion, and brutality. White slaveholders, in an attempt to justify their actions and maintain control, constantly sought to dehumanize enslaved people, often portraying them in public discourse and private thought as inherently inferior, childlike, or more like farm animals, as chattel property rather than human beings. But the consistent resistance of African Americans, in its myriad forms, powerfully challenged this dehumanizing narrative every single day.
And after major rebellions, like Nat Turner's in 1831, the controls became even harsher.
Yes, significantly harsher. Nat Turner's rebellion, in which enslaved people killed around 60 whites in Virginia, sent shockwaves of fear throughout the South. In response, state legislatures enacted even more restrictive slave codes. It became increasingly illegal for owners to free enslaved people, manumission. Teaching enslaved people to read or write was widely outlawed, seen as dangerous. Marriage between enslaved people had no legal standing. Their access to courts was virtually non-existent. Plantation owners also actively tried to suppress independent cultural expressions, like unsupervised religious meetings or traditional African practices, often out of fear fueled by events like the successful slave revolution in Haiti.
So, given these incredibly oppressive conditions, what forms did resistance take? How did African Americans fight back, both overtly and subtly?
Resistance was constant and took many forms. There were dramatic, organized rebellions, though these were relatively rare and almost always brutally suppressed. We mentioned the German Coast Uprising in Louisiana in 1811, the largest slave revolt in U.S. history, involving hundreds of enslaved people marching towards New Orleans before being defeated by militia and federal troops. Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 had a profound psychological impact. We even see instances like the 1842 revolt in the Cherokee Nation, where enslaved people owned by Cherokee planters attempted to escape to Mexico, showing the reach of slavery and resistance even within Native communities.
And the Amistad Mutiny.
The Amistad Mutiny in 1839 is another key example, though slightly different, as it involved Africans illegally captured and transported. Enslaved Africans led by Singbe P, Joseph Cinque, revolted on the Spanish ship La Amistad. When the ship ended up in U.S. waters, their case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Thanks to abolitionist support and legal defense, notably by former President John Quincy Adams, the court ruled they were illegally held and should be freed and allowed to return to Africa. This victory highlighted the international dimensions of the slave trade and provided a powerful legal and moral challenge to slavery.
Beyond armed rebellion, there was also crucial political activism and the use of print culture, especially among free Black communities in the North.
Absolutely. Figures like James Forten, a wealthy free Black sailmaker, inventor, and businessman in Philadelphia, became a prominent leader in abolitionist circles and civic movements. He used his influence and resources to advocate for racial equality and an end to slavery. The power of the written word was also vital. Freedom's Journal, founded in New York City in 1827 by Samuel Cornish and John Russwurm, was the first African-American-owned and operated newspaper in the United States. It served as a powerful platform to directly challenge racist stereotypes, promote abolitionist ideas, report on the conditions faced by Black people, and work to unify and uplift Black communities across the North. It showcased the growing importance of print culture in organizing resistance and building a collective identity.
So despite the brutal conditions, the constant dehumanization and the suppression, African Americans actively carved out and maintained a vibrant social identity and a rich culture. That in itself seems like an incredibly powerful form of inner resistance.
It truly was, and understanding this is critical to appreciating their resilience and humanity. They actively worked to build communities and preserve cultural traditions, often blending African heritage with American realities. Naming practices, for instance. Despite pressure to adopt European names, many enslaved people continued to use their African names among themselves or gave their children traditional names, consciously trying to sustain cultural memory across generations.
And language and oral traditions must have been vital, too.
Absolutely. They kept elements of West African and Caribbean languages and dialects alive, often incorporating them into American English. They maintained vibrant oral traditions through folk tales, like the famous Brer Rabbit stories, which often contained hidden messages of resistance and cunning, music, and dance. These were ways to pass down history, values, and a sense of shared identity, often outside the surveillance of slaveholders.
And their spiritual lives were also a profound source of strength and cultural preservation, often blending traditions.
Indeed. While some enslaved Africans, particularly those captured later, managed to maintain Islamic faith and practices, like the remarkable scholar Omar ibn Said, whose Arabic writings survive, many more embraced Christianity. However, they often adapted it to fit their own spiritual needs and cultural background, creating a uniquely African American form of Christianity. Services frequently incorporated elements like call and response patterns, spirituals expressing both sorrow and hope, drumming, when allowed, and ecstatic dancing forms that blended African religious traditions with Protestant worship. Religion provided solace, community, a sense of dignity, and often a powerful language of liberation.
And they created their own designated cultural spaces whenever possible.
Yes, despite immense obstacles, they created spaces for community and culture. The African Meeting House in Boston, built by the Free Black community in 1806, is the oldest surviving Black church structure in the U.S. It served not just as a place of worship, but as a vital center for abolitionist organizing, education, housing a school, and community life. And in places like New Orleans, Congo Square was a rare, officially sanctioned public space where enslaved and free African Americans were allowed to gather on Sundays. There, they could engage in music, dance, trade, and social interaction, explicitly preserving West African cultural traditions, drumming rhythms, dance styles that profoundly shaped the development of later African American music like jazz, and indeed American culture as a whole. This cultural resilience was a fundamental act of resistance against dehumanization.
Wow. Okay. We have really taken a whirlwind deep dive into a truly transformative era, haven't we? From 1800 to 1848. We've journeyed through the fierce political debates that gave birth to our first real political parties, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans.
Right, and then the Democrats and the Whigs.
We witnessed the Supreme Court, under John Marshall, boldly asserting its power of judicial review. And we saw the nation physically, dramatically expanding its borders through things like the Louisiana Purchase and the acquisition of Florida.
And we explored how that market revolution wasn't just about new technologies like canals, railroads, and factories. It fundamentally reshaped daily life. It created entirely new social classes, a middle class, a wealthy elite, a laboring poor, and it forged these powerful economic links across different regions and even across continents. It was a genuine economic and social upheaval that really left no corner of America untouched.
Absolutely. And we saw how democracy itself expanded significantly, at least for white men, with the fall of property qualifications, leading to the rise of mass politics under the Democrats and Whigs. But that expansion came alongside the tragic, brutal story of indigenous removal, like the Trail of Tears, and alongside fierce, often violent debates over the extent of federal power under figures like Andrew Jackson, especially concerning the bank and tariffs.
Yet, amidst all these profound struggles and contradictions, a distinctly American culture was actively being forged in art, literature, and philosophy, driven by those romantic ideals and the intense religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening. That spiritual revival, in turn, ignited these powerful movements for social reform, pushing for temperance, fighting for the abolition of slavery, and demanding rights for women.
However, simultaneously, and this is the paradox, the South aggressively solidified its distinct identity around the brutal central institution of slavery, intellectually moving its defense from a reluctant, necessary evil to an insistent, positive good.
Yeah, the contradictions are just glaring throughout this period.
This entire era, 1800 to 1848, is such a powerful reminder that the America we inhabit today, with all its complexities and ongoing debates, is a direct descendant of these early struggles, innovations, and compromises. The arguments over federal versus state power, the tensions between economic opportunity and inequality, the long fight for social justice and inclusion, they all have deep, tangled roots right here in this period.
So, as you, our listeners, reflect on this age of profound transformation, maybe consider this. How did a nation founded on the revolutionary ideals of liberty and that all men are created equal, a nation simultaneously fueled by unprecedented economic growth from the market revolution and stirred by widespread spiritual revival calling for moral perfection, How did this same nation so aggressively expand both its democratic participation for one group and the deeply entrenched, dehumanizing institution of slavery for another, all at the very same time?
And perhaps more importantly, what echoes of those profound, often uncomfortable, unresolved contradictions from that era do you still hear or perhaps see playing out in our society today?